Everybody hear me? Okay. Well, at this time, due to technical difficulties, I'm starting the meeting a couple of minutes late. And at this time, I will call the Anacortes City Council meeting for October 19th, 2020 to order. Ms. Hunt, would you take the roll?
Mr. Carter?
Here.
Mr. Young?
Here.
Mr. Walters?
Here.
Ms. Clayla McGrath?
Here.
Ms. Moulton?
Here.
Mr. McDougall?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, I'll move on to item 2, announcements and committee reports. And item 2A is my COVID-19 update. So as of today at Island Hospital, we've done 6,604 tests. We've had 70 positive cases in Anacortes. We've had 10 people hospitalized, and we've had 0 deaths. As of yesterday in Skagit County, we've had 1,200 positive cases in the county. We've hospitalized 101 people, and we've had 23 deaths. Washington State Department of Health confirms that we've had 98,661 confirmed cases with 2,258 deaths in the state. Our county must have fewer than 25 cases per 100,000 residents over 14 consecutive days, and we're currently at 49.5 new cases per 100,000 residents. Metric 2 is the county must have greater than 50 individuals tested per each new case during the prior week, and we're awaiting that update from the Department of Health, State Department of Health. Number 3, the percentage of individuals testing positive must be less than 2%, and we're currently at 1.7%. Metric number 4 is the percentage of beds occupied in the county must be less than 80%, and we're currently at 57.7%. And lastly, the percentage of beds occupied by COVID-19 cases must be less than 10%, and we're currently at 0.9%. So today we're meeting 3 of the 5 metrics. In the United States, we've had 8 million cases, and we've had 220,000 deaths. And globally, we've had over 40 million cases with 1.2 million deaths. And that is my COVID report for tonight. Item 2B is the Finance Committee. Do you have an update for the council and the public?
Mayor.
Walters.
The Finance Committee met. We largely went over the budget, but we also talked to the Parks Department about their proposed impact fees. They don't have those calculated yet, but we gave them some feedback on what we thought about whether or not a commercial impact fee for parks was appropriate. I think generally we thought that theoretically yes, but of course it depends on the amount, and that's not where we are at this point. So there's more to come on that.
Okay, thank you. And that completes your report.
Unless Mr. Carter has anything to add.
Mr. Carter?
So I was going to keep it short also because we're going to be going over some of it.
All right, thank you. All right, so now we have item 3, and we're open for public comment for anyone that would like to speak to the council on anything that is not on the agenda this evening. And I see we have one attendee. Does anyone want to speak? All right, I don't see a hand up. So yes, Mr.
Carter.
Mr. Carter, yes.
I was wondering if I could speak on something just for a minute.
Sure, go ahead.
So I got a few phone calls and emails last week about our Sunday gatherings down on 12th and Commercial. And so I spent this last Sunday down there talking to everyone. And it's enjoyable to see everyone coming out and supporting their candidates or their groups, kind of helping spread the word about their causes. But I also wanted to remind everyone that no one down there should fear for intimidation or any kind of threats. And if we could please keep it peaceful, we don't want anyone getting hurt or feel like they shouldn't be able to have their voice heard because of being threatened or intimidated by someone from a different belief. And that we, as a city, had passed that inclusion resolution, and to remind everyone just to keep it peaceful.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. And yes, that was just about a year ago that we passed that inclusion resolution. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, we'll move on now to item 4. It's our consent agenda, and that's for A, B, C, and D.
Mayor here.
Mr. Miller.
I move to approve consent agenda items A through D.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. Carter. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So now we're going to move to item 5A. This is open for public comment. This is a public hearing on the budgeted revenue sources, including a 1% property tax increase. And Mr. Hoagland will lead the conversation. I know he's going to do an introduction to the budget before we actually start to take action. So, Mr. Hoagland, turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a couple of slides I wanted to share. Okay. So a couple things I wanted to go over kind of briefly before the public hearing opens. So the public hearing is on revenue sources, and generally what I think of.
Sorry, Steve, just before you get started there, could you switch to presenter mode? Or switch out of presenter mode? So we have full screen.
So I apologize for the for the challenge that I'm experiencing. Okay. One more time. I don't know.
Go ahead and start the slideshow again.
Wait.
There you go. And then just right up there, display settings.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. So this is what council is seeing now?
Yes.
Ah, very
Ryan,
nice.
is that good?
Same.
I didn't hear yes or no. I'm gonna assume yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So the public hearing tonight is on revenue sources for the budget, including the 1% property tax increase. And I think that's primarily what the intention is of the public hearing. The rest of the revenue streams, of course, council and members of the public are welcome to comment on those revenue streams. But generally, the property tax increase is the thing that council has control over. I did want to point out a couple of things here. The governmental revenue streams I wanted to discuss kind of briefly are the 3 primary tax revenue streams. Pardon?
Please. Okay, everything on this side of the screen is shared.
Okay.
So
Very good. There we
I think that'll be better for the viewers at home as well.
No, thank you, Ryan.
Very nice, thank you. So the three primary tax revenue streams are property tax, sales tax, and utility tax. The utilities make up a big portion of the city's budget, but all of the utilities are funded by user fees, maybe grants to a smaller degree. But the tax revenues fund our governmental activities, and those are the things I want to make sure are really, really clear. Those are, I think, those tax revenues have the biggest impact to our citizens and to the quality of life that the city of Anacortes provides through its programs. So sales tax, utility tax, property tax, they're all significant tax revenues. They're all roughly the same size, from $4 to $5 million. The City Council can authorize an increase of 1% in property tax each year, and that's really the only direct control council has over those revenue streams. You know, aside from you could authorize a resolution for an increase in sales tax for the TBD, things of that nature, but you have direct control over the property tax increase. I wanted to point out that over the last 10 years, the Consumer Price Index has averaged 2.05% annual increase. So the 1% property tax increase is not even half of what the CPI is doing on an annual basis over the last 10 years. So property tax, it is the largest of those three revenue streams. It's $5.296 million in 2020. The 1% that City Council is authorized as an increase builds on itself each year. So think of it kind of in terms of compounding interest. That 1% grows each year that you take that and add it to the existing tax levy. And foregoing the 1% increase creates a gap that can't be recovered. And I wanted to try and illustrate that. For example, if you were to, as council, if you were to forego 2 years of the property tax increase, starting in this year, fiscal year 2020, our annual levy is nearly $5.3 million. 1% of that is nearly $53,000. That'd create a general levy of $5,349,000. The next year, generating a 1% increase of $53,000. And on down the line to 5 years from now, fiscal year 2024, you would have a levy of $5.511. If you decided to just skip 2 years of that 1% increase and maintain the 5.296 through fiscal year this year, 20 and 2021, and then implement the 1% increase in 2022, at the end of that same 5-year period, you would have a gap of $108,000, roughly the revenue that it takes to fund one FTE out of our governmental funds. I wanted to go through just kind of briefly what the impact would be to an average taxpayer, an average property tax payer in the city. The way property taxes are assessed, it's based on the assessed value of a home, and that assessment is in terms of how many thousands. So what we'll start out with is the total citywide assessment, which is nearly, so this is all of the property assessments for the entire city. It's nearly $4 billion. Stated in terms of thousands, it's 3.985 million. The current property tax levy is 5.296 million. So it's just dividing that levy into the assessment stated in thousands gives you a millage of $1.33. And then that millage is multiplied against the residential assessment in terms of thousands again. So the average assessment in the city of Anacortes in 2020 was $453,860. So $1.33 in millage times 453.86 gives you a property tax bill of $603. So that 1% increase to an average property tax payer would be $6.03. I believe this is where I wanted to end the conversation on property tax, but I wanted to, and utility tax, and we can talk about those in a little bit. Let me bring up, if I may, the resolution. We have a resolution for the property tax levy itself, but this year what I failed to put into the slides, we also have a property tax resolution for of substantial need. So the way the statute is written, the 1% increase, the increase is actually limited to sorry, can you see that resolution 3007?
Yes.
So the property tax increase is limited to the lesser of 1% or the IPD calculated in September based on the last 12 months. The IPD stands for Implicit Price Deflator. So for this year, in 2020, September of 2020, in calculation of the 2021 property tax levy, that IPD was actually 0.6%. So based on the statute, we're limited to a 0.6% increase unless there is a resolution of substantial need adopted by council as well. And that's what I wanted to present here tonight. You're not going to be taking action on these resolutions tonight, but I wanted you to have a look at them before you do. And I think these are coming back November 2nd. But in the resolution of substantial need, I list a couple of things that we're experiencing because of the COVID crisis. At the time of the writing of this resolution, our sales tax was down 11%. Currently, compared to budget, it's down, I think, 6.9% compared to budget, but that's still about a $250,000 shortfall just in that single revenue stream. The utility tax that's assessed against all of the city's utilities, in the water utility alone, that 7% utility tax is being reduced because water consumption across all user groups has decreased compared to the prior year. We're down 6.4% in water consumption. We're down in solid waste consumption, and sanitary sewer is calculated off of water sales, so sanitary sewer is down as well. In addition to that, what I don't have delineated in this resolution, there are a number of revenue streams that are related to sales statewide that the state shares, shared revenues. Those are down almost universally across the board as well. We have and we'll talk a little bit more about these when we get into the budget in a little bit later, but we also have the public safety sales tax that we have a shared credit from the county, and that's down significantly as well. So in some respects, the COVID crisis, there are some good news items that we've been talking about. One of them is sales tax, how it's not down as significantly as we were anticipating, but the reality is we're still down $250,000 in that revenue stream alone. So that's why I would recommend to council that the resolution of substantial need be adopted, and then the full 1% property tax authorization be executed at the time that these resolutions come back. So, Mayor Gear, those are the things I wanted to share before you open the public hearing. I'm done with my part of that, unless there are any questions.
Okay, questions? So at this time, I'll open the public hearing on the budget of revenue sources, including a 1% tax increase. And this is a discussion-only item this evening. And we do have 3 attendees. Would any of the attendees like to comment at this time? It is a public hearing.
Madam Mayor, we did have someone raise their hand. Oh, but they just put it back down, so.
Okay, all right.
Dennis Clark has continued to raise their hand. I will patch them through.
Oh, thank you.
Good evening. This is Dennis Clark.
Good evening. Welcome.
My address is 3805 M Avenue. I support the 1% property tax increase. I believe the substantial need should also reference the fact that The increases over the last several years have been less than the rate of inflation, although limited to 1%. That is all. Thank you for your consideration. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Is there anyone else who would like to comment on this evening? Okay, well, at this time, I'm going to turn it back to council for discussion. And tonight it's a discussion, and we'll bring it back for an action another evening. Yes, Mr. Carter.
That is the question for Mr. Hoagland. Was there a reason why, when you showed if we skip raising the 1% for 2 years versus if we just showed it at skipping it 1 year, was it not raised last year?
No, it was. In fact, it's been increased every year since I've been here. I chose those 2 years as an illustration just to show how quickly that 1% adds up, and then in 2 short years actually represents enough funding to fund a police officer, for example, a full-time equivalent employee.
Thank you.
Mayor Gear? Yeah, I think I say the same thing every year. The CPI is a good, excellent gauge, and I wouldn't support this if the CPI didn't support it, even if the average was high. As I know most of my colleagues know, there's the Washington State Constitution that limits the amount of property tax increase, and there's a reason that's in there, because us local governments would be raising it every second of the day. But I appreciate the primer on the CPI, and the CPI does indicate that there is a need to raise this property tax.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Any other comments or discussion tonight from the council?
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young?
Yes. Well, I think in looking at the reasons Mr. Hoagland presented, I think if ever there's a time, I think now is the time where we've all suffered a great deal under COVID and all the impact it had on all of us, revenue streams and all, and so I'm very supportive of it in this instance.
Thank you very much. All right. So my inclination then is to probably leave the public hearing open until next time, and we'll bring it back for an action item because we only had one member of the public comment this evening, and I'd like to make sure everyone has an opportunity. Does council have any other questions for Mr. Hoagland before we move on this evening? All right. So we're going to revisit this. When does this come back, Steve?
So we'll be talking about the budget again next week. At a minimum, it's scheduled for next week. But we generally try to start these budget hearings early in the year in case we want to continue those discussions. The property tax levy is scheduled to come back to council, I believe November 2nd. That's the same night that we have scheduled the public hearing on the entire budget itself. The property tax resolution is due to the county November 3rd, and the budget itself is required to be adopted by year end. Okay.
All right. Very good. Then we'll bring it back at that time. Okay. At this time, then, if there's no other comments, we'll move on to item 6A under other business. This is the review of the 2021 budget. This is discussion this evening, and I know Mr. Hoagland has another introduction for us, and then he'll give his presentation, and then it's open to the council to discuss at your will this evening. Mr. Hoagland.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I suspect I'm having the same trouble that I had to begin with. I really apologize. I don't feel like I'm generally this challenged by software. Goodness sakes.
There you go.
I like them apples. Right, thank you, Mayor. Let me zip ahead a few of these slides. So where we left off, we were talking about property tax. I did want to touch base on utility tax and sales tax a little bit. So as we just mentioned, those are so kind of the trifecta, those three large revenue streams. So utility tax is a tax that we've talked about, I think, more this year since the COVID has set in than maybe we have in the past, because that is dependent on consumption of utilities, and the water consumption and therefore sanitary sewer consumption has been down, solid waste consumption has been down a little bit, and all of those affect various tax revenue streams. They're all utility tax, but they go to, some of them go to different funds, and I'll explain that. So the utility tax on the charge of all of our utilities, there's a portion of that utility tax that goes into the general fund, and that funds our basic services. So all of our public safety and all of our administrative departments reside within the general fund. So that's one of our primary revenue streams that has been affected, by the COVID crisis. So hopefully things will get back to normal quickly, and that consumption will increase, and we'll see those numbers tick up. But right now, those are the things that we're seeing. Utility tax revenues down 4.6% compared to budget. And part of the solid waste utility tax, we have some of our council members may remember when we put the pavement management program into place, we increased solid waste utility tax to account for the additional wear and tear that the solid waste trucks place on the roads, and that additional utility tax was then posted into the road maintenance fund, and that utility tax revenue stream is down 8.5%. Sales tax, sales tax, this is one of the most well-known revenue streams that we have and is dependent on a growing economy. It's down 5.9% year-to-date through October compared to budget. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, that's kind of a good news story in that we were anticipating that the COVID crisis may have impacted that revenue stream even more, but we're still talking about $250,000. That's a substantial amount of money to try and accommodate that loss of that sales tax. We have a number of shared revenues, and I just wanted to touch on this briefly. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of give the magnitude of what we've been experiencing. It's kind of easy to focus in on those largest revenue streams, but we've got dozens, if not scores, of revenue streams that have been impacted by the COVID crisis, and some of them are shared revenues, such as state and county revenue streams that are shared with other local governments, and these are down across the board. They include gas tax for street maintenance. That is down 18%, and that tax is it's not a tax percentage. It's a straight amount that's charged per gallon of gas. So as the number of gallons drops, it's that revenue stream drops. So there's just been less consumption over the last 6 months for obvious reasons. The public safety tax rebate, I wanted to talk about. That's the 0.3% sales tax that the voters approved several years ago, and that sales tax we have interlocal with the county and other cities within the county to funnel that money to Skagit County to pay for the new jail. What this rebate I'm talking about is in recognition of the amount of sales tax that Anacortes contributed to the jail project, but it recognizes the difference in the amount of contribution of sales tax versus the impact that Anacortes has on the jail. We don't have the headcount that some of the other entities that use the jail have. So that rebate comes back to us to recognize that, and that's down 15.4% this year compared to last year. And the way the metrics are set up to calculate that rebate, that'll be down again next year, regardless of what happens through the rest of this year or how the economy recovers because of the timing of that rebate. Governmental expenditures, so just at a high level, I wanted to remind council and others that employee costs are the majority of the cost of our operating budget. And, you know, just kind of keeping in mind as we're going into this expenditure budget review, the most salaries have negotiated step increases and COLA increases that are insured by the collective bargaining agreements. Likewise, the health insurance coverage is insured by the CBAs, and those increases routinely break double-digit increases on a percentage-wise from year to year. So, and this year is down a little bit, this year being the 2021 budget, still up an average of 8% across the different plans that we have, which is a significant increase. So those total employee costs, payroll and benefits, are roughly $26 million of the total $63 million budget, which is 41%. When you take out the capital from that budget and you're just looking at the operating budget, employee costs are 49% of that total. So a couple of things that you'll see as we go through the budget, things that we've done to try and reduce the expenditure impact, to try and balance the budget. There's some significant reductions that we have in place. ER&R, DIS. ER&R is the equipment rental and reserve account. That's the fund that owns the vehicles and leases those vehicles out to the departments that use them. As part of that monthly lease charge, there are replacement charges for future equipment replacements. So this budget in our governmental fund eliminates the replacement charges for the year, and that generated a savings of $991,000. The asphalt overlay program, we reduced that from $1.85 million down to $850,000, and all of those savings in that asphalt overlay program have been shifted back over to the general fund in terms of property tax allocation. And also computing purchases this year, we've deferred a majority of the hardware that was scheduled to be replaced to conserve cash in the general fund at a cost of $287,000. And I wanted to point out some open positions that we have. So these unfilled FTEs, FTE stands for full-time equivalent. Full-time equivalent is one employee position. So unfilled FTEs are part of the budget. So when you look at those salary expenditure budgets and employee benefit expenditure budgets, we'll have positions budgeted that we aren't planning on filling at this time. So you'll see the expenditure, but when the time comes to incur that expense, the expense won't be incurred. We will be saving that cash flow. But we've got right now 13.7 positions across various positions. These are non-utility related. So 3 in parks. The ASAC is the Anacortes Senior Activity Center. So the director position there is still open, in addition to 2 maintenance positions in parks. An associate planner position is open. There's 3 positions in the police department, 2 officers, and an administrative position, 4 in the non-utility public works departments, a 0.7 FTE in the museum, and 2 FTEs in the library. So before we jump into the nuts and bolts of the budget, I'd be happy to discuss any of these kind of general items ahead of time if anybody would like to.
May I hear?
Okay, I can't say. I think it was Ms. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Hoagland, for your excellent presentations. My question is related to the FTEs. So could you clarify for me when we are planning on replacing these positions, or if we are, when we are?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. I meant to talk about this. So we wanted to leave those positions in the budget rather than pulling them out. By pulling them out, we would be required to go back to council with a budget amendment to get them added in. So we wanted to hold those positions within the budget in the event that the economy comes back hopefully more quickly than I'm anticipating. And if cash flows allow that to happen, we would like to start filling those positions as quickly as possible. So keeping in mind that we do still have a hiring freeze in place that we, for the most part, have been adhering to. But once we get into next year, I guess I'm anticipating more like after first quarter, maybe we'll have a sense of what the economy is going to do. Hopefully getting through the election, getting through hopefully another stimulus package will I'm hoping create some opportunities for us that might enable us to start looking at these positions that we have budgeted to start looking at filling those.
Great, thank you. So is there a deadline or a time limit, or can we leave these open indefinitely?
Yeah, these positions can be left open indefinitely. So,
great,
so that's kind of the thinking at this point. We will monitor how things go, and hopefully at some point in the near future be able to start looking at filling those, or at least some of them.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, someone else had a question.
Yeah, Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, that was me. Hey, Mr. Hoagland, I'm having a hard time translating from the percentage of down expected revenue to the dollar amounts that we're offsetting. So maybe it's not an answer for tonight, but perhaps next time we discuss it. For example, we anticipate being down, or you're using an 8.5% number down in solid waste revenue, but I don't know what that translates to your planning dollar, because
Sure.
I'm looking at this slide of asphalt overlay, and did that translate to $150,000, for example?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I will. So what you're asking for is the actual numbers that are driving those percentages to be able to.
Yeah, because now we're using real numbers on this side.
Gotcha.
As opposed to percentage. So again, I don't expect you to know those, but I think it would be helpful as we're looking. Okay, where does the 1 million or the 991 come from?
Right.
And again, I understand the projections, so it's kind of challenging, but I think that'll help do a direct, more of an apples to apples than apples to pears.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So as we start going through some of these revenue numbers as well, particularly in the general fund, that's where we have the most variety of revenues. I'll try and remember to point some of those out as we're going through and be able to make that connection.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
I had some similar questions that Mr. Miller had. And then also I'm wondering what the dollar value is of the 13.7 unfilled FTEs.
Yeah, I don't have that right off the cuff. I can get that pretty quickly. I'd be happy to email that out to council tomorrow. I actually think I have an email in my inbox someplace with that information in it. So I can get that out to council and maybe get that posted on the website.
Okay, that'd be great. And I want to lay a little bit of foundation for why I'm interested in that number, because if we are anticipating receiving that amount of revenue and then not spending it, which is the effect of leaving the positions in the budget, but on not filling them, there is an alternative to that, and that's spending that money on some of the things that we're choosing not to spend it on in this proposed budget, which are also on the screen here. So, for instance, if we don't replace a car that's due for replacement, maybe next year the car is cheaper. So $1 not spent today actually might translate into more money if we save it, defer that purchase, and then have to spend the $1 in the following year, 2022, on replacing the car. But that's different from the asphalt overlay project, because as Public Works has drilled into us, every year that the roads go by without the slurry seal or without the overlay is a year that they degrade more than the dollar amount that we don't spend on them. So $1 spent today is actually cheaper than $1 spent tomorrow.
Yep.
So we might want to choose to spend that money on the overlay program that we had already set in motion and set an annual budget for by resolution. And I want that choice to be really clear to council so that we can make it intelligently and deliberately. So I think we'll need that dollar amount from those positions. If those positions are important, then we can keep track of them for the following year. But usually we don't have the opportunity to cut positions because there are real people in them, and those decisions have real effects on those people's lives. And here, these are empty positions, so there isn't such a consequence, and it may really be an opportunity to make the decision a little differently.
Yeah, quite true. It's I would wholeheartedly agree. It's always preferable to gain through attrition rather than a direct layoff if that's what you're faced with. And you make a good point about the asphalt overlays, and I think you could say the same thing in the DIS as well. As your technology starts to age, it just becomes less efficient. I think many times, my experience, it becomes less efficient, and you may be losing in productivity as well. So there may be some kind of intangibles that aren't really evident as well. Yeah, no, you're right. Pardon?
For cars, there might be maintenance costs too.
Yeah. These budget decisions are hard decisions, no question.
Any other questions for Mr. Hoagland at this point? Okay.
Mayor Deere?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
One thing I would say about eliminating staff positions, even though they're not filled, is that the level of service that we provide as a city that those positions also generate income for the city in some ways. So it is a complicated question. I just wanted to add that.
Yep. All right, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, bear with me for just a moment while I pull up my budget worksheet. So I wanted to, this is the part of the budget review that I guess I have mixed feelings about it. I actually like looking at the budget this way, but I know it can be challenging. Okay, so this is the file that was included in the council packet. So this is the front page that shows the summary by fund, and there's two columns here that are exactly the same, the revenue and expenditure budgets, and that's just because of my worksheet, just to keep track as I'm going through the budgets to make sure that those funds are balanced. The general fund totals 19.357, and over on the right side of the page here, you can see the makeup of that 19.3 million by these various departments that make up the general fund. So anyway, totaling 64.6 million. A couple of things I would point out just kind of quickly here. The TBD pass-through, this 1.1 million right here, this is the sales tax that the voters approved a couple of years ago. All of that money passes through to the road maintenance fund, supports not just the road overlay fund, but that entire road maintenance fund is eligible for the use of that TBD money. The use of this is part of what allowed us to redirect some of that property tax back into the general fund. Affordable housing, $500,000. This is the affordable housing sales tax that just was recently approved by voters. So that we're estimating at 500,000. We've got still a lot of ground to cover in that arena. We still have contracts to complete and bring back to council, but that ball is now rolling. So the first page here, the layout of this shows so this is looking at general fund revenues, and I can explain in as much detail as council would like to see any of this, but I would just maybe encourage you to ignore this first, like the left half of the page. This is all related to our accounting system, the bars numbers, and the descriptions. But what I hope you get out of that is just some sense of what the expectations are for these revenue streams. So starting at the top here, property tax, we talked about that a little bit, but we're allocating $1.19 million in property tax into the general fund. This $4.8 million in sales tax. You can see this is what we are budgeting for 2021. The budget for 2020 was $4.9 million. What we have collected year to date, or at the time of this publishing, was 2.5. So the way we got to the 4.8, there was really kind of a pretty deep V in our sales tax collections. We were down 20 and 25%, I believe, for the first couple of months of the COVID crisis, and then it came back up pretty significantly. And the last 2 months have actually been, they've actually averaged it out to zero. 1 month was down 3%, and the following month up 3%. So it looks like sales tax is starting to come back. So the way we ended up at this 4.8 million was projecting that 3% through the end of this year, and then starting the first 6 months of next year being equal to what we did in 2019, and then the last half of the year, each of those 2 months increasing, I think, by 1%. So we end up, by the end of the year, essentially being equivalent to where we were at the end of last year. The public safety sales tax, I show it down a little more significantly. It's mainly because that's a revenue that's collected at the county level, and it's redistributed to the city on a per capita basis. So our local sales tax seems to be a little bit stronger than some of the other areas in general. That's why that is a little bit lower. And don't worry, I won't spend as much detail on all of these revenue streams, but some of these large ones I wanted to give a little bit of a picture. So this B&O tax, this is actually, these titles are driven by the BARS manual. The BARS manual is published by the state auditor's office, so we are required to follow BARS manual templates. But this is the utility tax that we charge on the public utilities. So the public utilities being the utilities of the city, water, sewer, storm, and solid waste. So we had budgeted $2,082,000 for this year. We're budgeting $2,015,000 for next year, and that's really based on, that's based on the historical amount of collection that we have through October. So I'm hopeful that things will have picked up in the following year, and our actuals will exceed that number, but that seems like a reasonable estimate at this point. The private tax the utility tax on private utilities, this is things like natural gas, electricity, cable TV. We had budgeted, you can see we budgeted $2.2 million. This is back in 2019, and our actuals were well below that, about 10% below that. So the following year, this year, we budgeted 1.93, but we're starting to see some of those utilities, some of those private utilities come back a little bit stronger. So we did budget a slight increase in that revenue stream for next year at $2,030,000. Leasehold excise tax, that's a pretty consistent revenue stream for us. That's leasehold taxes are the taxes charged on properties that are that are leased by government. It's essentially a property tax in lieu of fee. Franchise fees, pretty consistent. These are some of our shared revenues with the state, the marijuana tax, liquor control board profits. All of these estimates come directly from the state. State provides metrics on those. Investment interest, we're projecting that to be down a little bit as our interest rates are dropping. Our portfolio is just earning less interest, and you can see a few years ago how great that our investments were doing. We're not anticipating that in the coming years. This overhead, the overhead allocation is what the general fund charges to the utilities for the use of the administrative services in the general fund, the things like the finance department, the legal department, HR, things of that nature. Since those utilities benefit from the city having those departments, we allocate on a budgetary basis part of the cost of those to the utilities. Transfers in, this is offset with the work that we're expecting the facilities department to do in City Hall. So that should balance, just be a in and out balance off of the facilities projects. Criminal justice sales tax, this is a shared revenue from the state. You can see in this year, 2020, we were projecting $426,000, which was just kind of a metric based off of the prior year. Looking at what we've collected year to date, that sales tax has really dropped off, and that's another one of those. It's from the state, so the state collects its sales tax from the state in general and then distributes on a per capita basis, and we're expecting that to decrease significantly compared to prior years. A variety of small revenue streams. This is the business licenses. We've seen fewer business licenses issued this year, so next year's estimate reflects that. DIS, that's our Department of Information Services, that's the computing department. That's down compared to the current year's budget for the replacement charges that we talked about earlier, not being included in those charges to those departments. The $165,000 here, this is the CDBG grant. $606,000 is for building permit revenues. The building arena still seems to be going strong, which is great news for us. All of these revenue streams are related to building and planning activity. Boat launch leases, estimating at $67,000, which was what we had budgeted last year. Fiber, our fiber service, I worked closely with the fiber department to, not to develop, they developed the estimate, but that this is based on their projections of the continued build out and hookup rate that they've been experiencing. I wanted to point this out. This is new for this year's budget. The $2.5 million, this is a loan. We have it termed here long-term loan. And this is to offset some of the costs that are anticipated in the continued capital spending in the fiber department to continue the backbone build out. This is that shared revenue from the county I was talking about. This is the public safety rebate. So looking back to, this is 2019, we had budgeted $126,000, but because the sales tax actually came in much higher, our actual allocation was $139,000. Following year, we budgeted $142,000. That's this year. And we collected $138,000, and we're projecting $120,000 for next year. Traffic infractions down a little bit. Yeah, so just a lot of little miscellaneous revenue streams. And then we're down, so I guess that's it. So that runs us through the general fund and brings us to the Parks Department. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. I'd be happy to answer any questions or revisit anything if there are any questions on general fund revenues.
Yes. Mr. Walters?
Public safety sales tax was only off from budget by about $4,000, line 2165. Have we collected all the sales tax we're expecting to collect this year? It seems like
So
that'll hit the mark.
Right. So the way the interlocal is set up, the metric on that calculates that allotment in May or April, something like that. So that comes in a lump sum every year, and it's based on that activity as calculated. I think it's in April to give us some time to get through kind of the month-end adjustments or the year-end adjustments, and then the check is cut at that time. So that's why it's for this year it's pretty close to what we had budgeted. But next year I'm anticipating it to be even lower because the timing of that will capture the majority of that, down period this year.
Okay.
Parks and Rec, so the majority of, and again, all of these funds have a lot of little revenue streams, but the vast majority of funding for the Parks and Rec Department is in sales tax. So they were allocated 1.8 this year, or 1.798, and the same similar allocation next year. So this, they've collected, or so far in the Parks Department, we've collected $1,024,000 in property tax, keeping in mind sales tax comes in generally twice a year in May and November. Same thing with cemetery. The majority of funding is property tax, cemetery services, and there's two cemetery services. One is, I think one is grave sales and one is headstone sales, but that's why there's two different line items there. That brings us into the library. Pretty much same thing in the library. Vast majority of the funding is in property tax. I did want to point out in the library, this line right here, unassigned fund balance, when you see that's fund balance is cash reserves of that fund. So when you see a positive number, that's money being taken out of fund balance to balance that that department's budget out. And you may remember from that initial slideshow earlier in the evening, the library is down 2 FTE right now. I know that they would desperately love to fill at least one of those. It's actually 3 positions, 2 half-time positions and a full-time position. But because they're down those FTEs, we're projecting that the cash flow impact won't exceed. It'll actually be less than what's budgeted out of fund balance. What I'm trying to say is, we don't think they will need that, but we have that extra budget in there from those unfilled positions.
Hey, Steve.
Yes, ma'am.
It's Christine. Hey, I had one. Can we go back? I just had one question I was kind of curious about. It's line 2250, and it's the recreation fees taxable. I was just kind of curious why all of the projected is $105,000, but the actuals are significantly lower, and why we've brought that to 2021.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Yes, you're right. So realistically, if things continue the way they are now, we won't see that. But this again was one of the funds where they're currently down 3 FTE, and we are anticipating that we won't fill perhaps one of those next year. I don't see them getting through the entire year, continuing to be down 3 FTE, but maybe they continue down 2, but that would provide enough cash flow savings to offset that. So the hope is, this time next year, that looks like a reasonable estimate on our part. But yeah, it's a good point. If things continue the way they are now, we won't hit that mark.
Thank you.
Street Fund 104. So this is the utility tax on solid waste. So we're budgeting at $347,000. We were at $363 last year. We're currently at $247. As I mentioned earlier, that has been that's been off. We won't come back. I don't think we'll hit this $354,000. It's been down a little bit, and that was, I think, down due to the reduction in building activity when the quarantine order was first put in place. Since the building activity, it's continued to be pretty strong since it's been allowed to continue. So that's why it's not maybe as low as you might expect, but that's the reasoning behind it. So hopefully that's the case. The motor vehicle fuel tax, I talked about this a little bit. That's a metric that comes directly from the state estimate. The next fund is Fund 105. This is the street construction fund. We're estimating transfers in of 1.4. We'll talk about this maybe a little more next week when we talk about public works, but all of those revenues are related to specific road projects. So that's something I don't think I talked about yet. The intent was tonight to look at governmental activities that are mostly reliant on taxes, and then public works next week. So brings us down to Fund 107, 106 is the TBD, so this is a pass-through. Anything that comes in here will be passed directly on to the Road Maintenance Fund. So Fund 107, that's the Washington Park Fund. We're closely with the Parks Department to develop these revenue estimates based on what they're seeing at the park now and our hope that things will continue to recover. We're projecting a pretty normal year next year. So you can see our estimates for this year, 2020, we had camping fees initially budgeted at 196. We're seeing 140. Those are probably pretty much done for the year, but we're anticipating next year being back up around that 190,000 threshold. Fund 108 is the Parks Capital Improvement. So most of the revenues that come into Fund 108 are transfers in from either grants or from REIT to support those projects. The one consistent revenue stream that's in that fund, this lease down here, this is the Mount Airy lease. That $28,000 a year comes in from that tower lease on Mount Airy.
So Steve, what is the Recreation Conservation Fund? Is that for the depot restroom? Is that for the cemetery? What's that funding?
This right here?
350,000.
350.
Yeah. No. Okay. Well,
we'll be able to see that on the expenditure side. I don't remember which project that is, but we'll be able to see it on the expenditure side. Okay. Fund 110 is the Ambulance Service Fund. It gets shot of property tax. These are transport revenues from Medicaid and from Medicaid transports and other regular transports that we bill insurance for. We don't bill it. We have a third-party biller. And then also the 1.389 is from the county EMS levy. 112 is our impact fees. Nothing unusual there. Keeping in mind on the revenue side of this, we're balancing out some of the projects that we're planning on using as well. Fund 113 is the ACFL fund. It does have one consistent revenue stream. That's $50,000 a year from the quarry revenues. In 2019, there was a true up when every couple of years, they do a survey of how much rock was actually harvested out of the quarry, and then there's a true up done at that time. That's why the big jump in revenue there. Fund 135 is the lodging tax fund. So the lodging tax, I guess we can talk about that a little bit. It's just been gangbusters the last couple of years, $440,000. We were budgeting $434,000 this year. So far, we've brought in $127,000. So we're budgeting $373,000, as I think that's the amount of awards that council approved for this year. There is healthy reserves in that fund, over $1 million if council wanted to take action to do something there. So I just point that out when the lodging tax committee is just in the process now of setting up the meetings to consider those applications. But when those applications come to full council, just wanted to point that out. There is cash reserves there if council wanted to do more than just what's available in the estimated revenues. So I guess what I mean is, if we really think you're only going to bring in $127,000 again next year, that you wanted to award $300,000 or something like that to local businesses to promote their, or not local businesses, to local events to promote those events to to garner tourists into the city, there is some cash reserves available for that. So that brings us down into 401 is the water fund, and from here on is public works. So if unless there are any questions or anything you want to revisit, maybe we can jump out of this and then start going through the expenditure side of the budget.
No questions?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
I guess I would just like to express some discomfort at predicting the same level of revenue as prior years, and for example, line 2250 for parks recreation fees, while we are somewhere on a piece of scratch paper keeping track of the fact that we are also down staff and there's going to be some similar amount that will be knocked off of the expenditure budget.
Well, it's a point well taken, Mr. Walters. I would suggest it's slightly more than a piece of scratch paper. It brings to mind, though, that I do owe council a finance update. We had been doing that kind of on a monthly basis since the COVID crisis set in. But that is something that we do monitor on a monthly basis, where those revenues and expenditures are in comparison to what we've budgeted. So we do try hard to keep track of where we're at on that, because it's a good point. If those were to get away from us, if we weren't monitoring those things and they got away from us, we could get in trouble. So, I guess that's my thinking is I have maybe a higher level of comfort because I work with this daily and I print those monthly reports and review that material on a monthly basis. And so perhaps I need to come back to council on a more frequent basis while, the economy is still not great, to try and give council that same level of comfort.
Yeah, and some of it is just that it's not exclusively the finance director and the mayor's responsibility to manage this. It's also our responsibility to set realistic revenue numbers and expenditure budgets.
Okay, any other comments on this portion? Okay, Mr. Hoagland, you want to move on to expenses?
Okay, so we do have department heads on the line with us tonight if there are questions. But I wanted to move through this. We can spend as much time as you want, but the majority of departments, there really aren't any, there aren't new programs. There really aren't, with the exception of a couple of departments, there aren't new programs or new staff. So I think it'll be pretty easy to work through a lot of this, but please stop me if you have questions, concerns, and I'm, happy to discuss this at as much detail as you would like. Starting at so the General Fund, Fund 001, Department 110, this is the Legislative Department, City Council. So illustrated in that same format that we looked at revenues, 2019, actuals and budget 2020, year-to-date actuals and budget, and I believe year-to-date was, I want to say it was through October 5th, and then the 2021 budget request. So the 2021 information is this brown and tan colors on the right side of the page. But most of this, and the dark brown is stuff that's automatically populated by the finance department, either because of salaries or benefits or interfund insurance, things of that nature. We do those calculations and then populate those fields. But nothing really unusual. $40,000 budgeted for A-Town and ordinance publications. Typical office supplies. The professional services of $15,000 is primarily the SCOG dues, some postage. $60,000 is budgeted for county voter registration costs. You can look back through the history. It's kind of every other year when you have a big election is when we have a bigger cost from that. So, but yeah, kind of basic, nothing unusual. The mayor's budget, the executive section, kind of the same thing. Salaries, benefits, a little bit of money for subscriptions, retreats, training. Nothing really unusual there. In the court, again, nothing really unusual. We do contract with the county to provide judicial services, so we, you'll see that down here, also for probation services. So in the court, the $131,000 that we have in those expenditures, the majority of that is passed through, or not passed through, is expenses that'll be paid to the county. Down here in this section is our public defender. We have $25,000 budgeted in professional services, and that's primarily for conflict and overflow attorney for cases that our public defender can't take on because they have a conflict or they're nearing their case limit. They can contract out with other local attorneys for that work. Department 210 is the finance department, $15,000 for paper and envelopes. We do pick up the cost for the common area out here in City Hall for paper and envelopes. $45,000 for professional services. That's primarily the audit fees for the state auditor's office. $15,000 for communication. We do pick up the finance department pays that. City main line, the mailing machine, postage meter, those common area items. So not a lot there either.
Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Walters.
how come the finance department has a cell phone?
As a cell phone, we actually have, I think, 3 cell phones. I guess I don't really understand the question. So,
Aren't you in the office all the time? Or, home office?
I am in either this office or the home office. I do appreciate having access to a cell phone to be able to check email, take calls when I'm away from my desk. I find that I probably spend more time on work-related items when I'm at home than I would otherwise, but I feel like it makes us efficient. We have a payroll accountant that we have a cell phone for as well. They are on the phone pretty much constantly, especially during every other week when there is payroll to process. She takes a lot of phone calls, so we have a phone for her. She's been working at home almost exclusively since the pandemic set in, and my finance manager, Philip, has a phone as well. I find it important to be able to contact him, particularly with him being at home during this COVID crisis. So I guess I'm a little surprised at the question. I'd be happy to explain further. We've got over 100 cell phones issued to city staff, so I'm curious what your thoughts are on the cell phone issue.
I'm just looking at places where we could save money.
Mm-hmm. I'd be happy to give my phone up.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
I think I'm more interested in that question, not necessarily your cell phone, but Mr. Walters brings up a good point about the 100 cell phones in the city. So that's just something to think about.
Yeah. Sure.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
And I think of it mainly in the context of the new work from home environment that we find ourselves in, and whether there could be some transformational changes in how we use technology and using Wi-Fi at home, using Anacortes fiber at home to maybe save some costs overall, maybe incur new costs even if we are expecting employees to work from home all the time. But it definitely is a transformational thing, and I haven't heard too much about how that has all been happening at the city since the COVID lockdowns and everything.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Young.
Oh, Mr. Young, excuse me.
Yes. Thank you. No, and I hear the point that's being made about cell phones, particularly right about now. But, given that where we are with Mr. Hoagland, finance and I think those are really justifiable in the sense that having access to the team that you need, but also at the same time, it just sort of prevents you from having your personal phone, using it to call a variety of different people that you may not necessarily want to have your home phone, but you would want them to have your cell phone that's city issued. So, but, on the other hand, the other 100 and something phones, I do think that's worthy of taking a look at to see if it applies, ways that we can save. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And to your point, Mr. Walters, during COVID, we've done a lot of work at home, and the service we're providing has been seamless. So especially now during COVID, cell phones have been invaluable. And when I first got here, many of public works staff were out on jobs, and they were using their own phones. I'm talking 4 or 5 years ago, and I just felt that in this day and age, we needed to, number one, be using just city resources, and also on a job site to be able to communicate in real time is really important. So it is something we can look at, but it is something over the last 4 or 5 years we have gone to more cell phones because, quite frankly, that's how we all communicate now. And we got away from people using their own phones. And I think at some point they even use radios, and there's still maybe some radios used. But I guess it's a broader conversation, and it does come with a price tag. So.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
And just to head off any future newspaper article, titled something about cell phones. My question is really not about cell phones particularly, and definitely not about Mr. Hoagland's cell phone specifically, but it's more broad, as you say. It's a broader question of how we're going to transition in technology in the next year and how we've done it in the last year.
Right.
I think that's worthy of a separate conversation, and it's going to have some financial, I mean, it obviously already had financial impacts this year, and I wonder how the financial impacts are going to come about next year too. And I think that's probably something that we ought to talk about in a whole separate conversation. The city council may want to be involved in how we operate as a city government going forward.
Right.
Certainly, there are a whole lot of organizations that have figured out you don't need staff at all at work. That the metric of whether staff are performing or not is how many hours their butt's in a chair, but actually what units of work they're producing. And I would really enjoy having the city of Anacortes be leading edge on that issue.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. We'll have that. Mr. McDougall, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I actually wanted to reiterate what Mr. Walters just said, that really it isn't about a conversation about cell phones, and in particular, it's more a conversation about how work has changed. And I think I'd love the suggestion, like, let's have Anacortes City Hall lead that change. Here we all are, we're in our 7th month of holding city council meetings, not over phones, but over internet video services. So, as part of that conversation, it would be interesting to see what our utilization on our cell phones have been over the last year compared to prior years. Is utilization up because of the work from home, or is it actually down significantly? That could be part of that larger conversation, I think.
No, I really like that. Any other comments from the council on that? Yeah. Yeah, because telework may be here to stay for all we know. It's like in planning alone, we've been very, very efficient and done a great job. All right, go ahead, Steve.
Okie dokie. That brings us to Department 220, which is the IT department. I point out the small tools and minor equipment line. Last year we spent $333,000 out of it. We budgeted $333,000. That's this year, 2020. Next year we're budgeting $46,000. I mentioned this earlier. We are deferring the majority of our hardware purchases this year, just to save that general fund cash. $452,000 in professional services. This is what the sum of our software requirements for the city. I won't read through all of them, but speaking of phones, text archiving, there is a cost to public records. Text archiving, $17,000. Spam firewall, email encryption, email archiver, $18,000. So Microsoft 365 is an $81,000 cost next year. Eden Software, that's our ERP, our Enterprise Resource Planning System, that's $85,000. $41,000 is our Laserfish cost. $50,000 for CertGrid. Website $7,000. Anyway, you can see the line up there. I'll give you a second to read through those, and happy to talk further about any of these. Granicus, this is the program we use to broadcast the council meetings and planning commission meetings. $35,000. That's a 3-year contract, about $12,000 a month.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
Since the note there indicates that contract is starting a new term in 2021, have we thought seriously about whether that is meeting our needs?
We have actually, and we've actually we've had several meetings about this, and we have talked about trying to transition just to YouTube Live and not go through Granicus. There are some options, but there are some things that Granicus provides that we wouldn't have otherwise, and I don't know that we have the means to meet those needs right now. Indexing the agenda to the meeting, the e-comments function, some of those types of things, those interfaces that we have with the community is done through Granicus, as well as broadcasting the meetings.
Okay, go ahead, Steve.
That's it for IT, unless there are any other questions. Our HR department, it's pretty, so nothing unusual here in HR. I will point out that we are in the process of interviewing. We have gone for a new HR director, so we are in the second stage, trying to set up second interviews with several of the applicants. It was a good applicant pool. The initial set of interviews went well, and I think everybody associated with this process is very encouraged at the prospects. But happy to discuss any of these further if council has any questions on any of these. We have a few more bars numbers in HR than we do some of the other departments, because they have such a varied, kind of varied work requirements with different departments. But nothing unusual, nothing kind of out of the ordinary. So that would bring us to planning, Department 240. Professional services, $14,000 for continued critical areas review, and that $14,000 includes $6,000 fee to membership fee to Northwest Clean Air. $45,000 DNR lease for waterfront. We have $50,000 budgeted in professional services for South Commercial. This $165,000 is associated with the CDBG grant, $155,000 of that from the grant, and then an additional $10,000 that the city traditionally supports community action with. This $18,000, we have an interlocal agreement with the Skagit County Health Department, where we allocate 10% of our liquor tax revenues to the county.
For what?
That money, it's part of substance abuse support, so we use the interlocal agreement carves out 10% of the monies we get from liquor control to county health department to use towards combating that. So that brings us down to Department 250, which is the legal department. $15,000 for code publishing, $5,000 for typical office supplies, $90,000 is tabbed for the prosecuting attorney contract. Pretty basic. That's about it for legal. That brings us into the fire department. So currently, the fire department, there are, I believe there are 6 direct staff plus partial allocation of the director. $11,000 in supplies, small tools, minor equipment, $5,250. The interfund obviously is related to the vehicles and IT. We talked about that already. Professional services, $149,000 in total. Payments to Noanet, Wave, Nokia, various. $17,000 for operating rentals and leases. This is made up of pole attachment fees, then dark fiber leases. Here's the capital makeup, $2.6 million. the majority of that contracting work with library to MST, and MST underground placement makes up a large majority of that. Cables, bulbs, etc. Machinery and equipment, 152,000. Majority of that is ONTs. Any questions on fiber? Move into the police department. Again, we talked about the police department earlier. They are currently dealing with a few open positions. There's nothing unusual or new in the 2021 budget. I'll roll through some of these and holler if you'd like me to stop.
So Steve, I do at this point want to mention that when we were talking about positions earlier, and you talked about 3 openings in the police department, I know that she's small. It's imperative that he gets 2 positions, and he can talk to the council about that. But I know that we've had discussed that, and just to be whole and provide the level of services that they're providing today, I highly recommend we move forward with those 2, but he can communicate that also. So I just wanted to put that on the record tonight, so the council didn't go away thinking that we could hold off. Chief, are you there? Do you want to speak up at this time?
I am here. Thank you, Mayor.
Welcome.
So a little surprised, I guess, by the events tonight so far. But so at the end of this month, we're actually going to be 4 positions down, 3 commission staff and 1 records position. Due to people leaving our department for personal reasons. So Steve and I have talked in the past, Mr. Hope, talked in the past about this a little bit though, and to keep our level of service moving forward, I would like to at least be able to replace 2 of those positions in the very near future. The goal really is to get, a detective back in the drug task force sometime after the first of the year too. We've been out of that position for a few years now. It's a great position for us to fight the drug battle in our town. It gives us attention, locally too from the drug task force. It also is a good recruiting tool and retention tool for our staff. So I think being, 4 positions down going into next year would be difficult to staff the patrol side of things a little bit, but also that task force position. I'm happy to entertain questions about that or
Thank you.
Mr. Young.
Hey, Chief. My question is more about in looking at the work that the police force does, across the broad spectrum. What about the social worker or the counselor for, let's say, domestic issues that are nonviolent, or those issues where a social worker or therapist, counselor would be, I guess, not a better use, but a more efficient use of what the call is really about? Is that something that's baked in or something that's been talked about? How does that work?
Talked about, Mr. Young, yes, it has been, and I think in a perfect world, that would be a great position to fill. I think right now, in terms of our call load, it would be hard to keep a full-time, better social worker busy in the city of Anacortes all the time, though. We also have access to the county's team now that they initiated earlier this year. They've been over a couple times helping us out, though, so we have that resource available to us. But again, I think, that's a great thing to have, I think, long-term. I think more for our immediate day-to-day needs, though. I think, the uniform position is important for that, and also the drug task force position is important for that, though, too. We do, again, our staff is very skilled in handling people in crisis, wonderful to have somebody, full-time, but again, I doubt we could keep that person busy 40 hours a week, though,
I guess the reason I'm asking that, it's been a lot of discussion nationally about, some of the calls. I know the police are called on this plethora of issues that are not necessarily law enforcement, but sometimes it's crises management. And I was just wondering, even if it's not a full-time position, a part-time, quarter-time, those are things that I just thought would be something we should consider here. I understand Mount Vernon has a part-time position, if I'm not correct on that. And I was just wondering if something, part of that person being utilized here would be something that, you know, we would consider as well, or you would find useful.
I think I find it very useful over time, yes, you know, something I think would be important to have. Again, we were kind of given the orders this year, you know, to hold off on positions, and
Right.
so I think that's a great thing for the future, when the world kind of evens back out again, though.
Right.
But for right now, for immediate needs, I think there's better uses for that right now, in all honesty. But no, I think it's a great idea, a great resource again for future needs, though.
Good. Well, you know, I guess because what I was thinking about is that at some point, you know, we could just really extrapolate out disaggregately what the calls are about and just really begin to see that. I know you spoke once before about having done that. I know you've looked at it. I would just be curious to see that at some point going forward. Thank you, Chief.
There's no shortage of people, you know. It's not, the problem's not getting less by any means, it's increasing now.
Thank you.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Hey, real quick on the point that Mr. Young brought up. I know I've at least reported a couple times to the council about Mount Vernon's position through the Law and Justice Council that I sit on with Chief Small. And that's still kind of a position that's, I guess, it's working out great for them. But again, like Chief Small mentioned, the amount of time for Anacortes, it would be really challenging. So we were looking at some sort of shared relationship. But I think I hear Chief Small's point is, and I appreciate the mayor making the point, the priority would be to get these commissioned officers online for patrol, and then work to see if we can get, I think her name's Erin, I always forget her last name, but and how that has really worked out, because I think it's really only been a year, maybe a year and a half, and there's still some things that Mount Vernon is learning about that position and how effective it is. So again, I'm interested in that as well. But I think for budget purposes, I appreciate what the mayor said about these positions, because I'm very uncomfortable going down, you know, 3 commissioned officers in our department.
I think one last point too, if I'm allowed to, here, Mayor. You know, I think we're pretty good right now with the staff about identifying the needs that people need, whether it's housing, mental health care, whatever. You know, I think the big missing component still is those resources. Those things get filled up so fast in our county, you know, so it'd be great to have a better social worker to identify those things more, work with people, but again, you need resource on the other end to put those people into there too. I think it's a big missing component still in our county.
Right. And I do want to assure the council that right now, when we do have an issue that's greater than the police department, we have resources that we've been working with the county. Anacortes Family Center has been invaluable. They bring in their resources. I know just last week or 2 weeks ago, they helped find some resources and housing for 3 or 4 gentlemen in town, and it was a village between our police department, other county resources, and the Anacortes Family Center. So we are using everything that's available to us today, but with a long-term goal of what you have in mind, Anthony. Absolutely. So. Yes, Mr. Walters.
And there might be opportunities in the future where, say, a position at another organization, or maybe the family center is at halftime and they want to take it to full time, and we can help, you know, supplement that money to get them to where they need to be, or add a position or something like that. We should be looking for those opportunities and listening to those organizations' needs so we can see where we can make those changes. But with respect to the police department, I want to drag us back to the mechanical question of how the budget is constructed, because I would like the council's adoption of the budget to reflect the choices that we're going to make. And right now, from what I understand, all these positions are in the budget, but the plan is to just not fill them. So we would approve a budget that has all these positions approved, but then they wouldn't get filled. In the alternative, if we could make choices, if like we have the dollar value of a position in some other department, And maybe we say, well, we're not going to fill that position in that other department, and we're not doing that because we want to dedicate that revenue to the police department. Then we could make those choices and we could express ourselves through the budget where our priorities are. But right now, we're not doing that. And so I think that for me, is fundamentally just passing the buck. I mean, it's passing the buck to the mayor and the finance director, who I trust to make the right decisions. It's just that I feel some responsibility to make those decisions myself.
Okay. Well, that's why we're here. Okay. All right. So any other comments on the police budget at this time? Go ahead, Mr. Hoagland.
Okay. So that's, yeah, there's nothing unusual. I can point out some of these larger items, scheduled 911 fees. We're seeing a budgeted increase this year just based on, that's a pass-through. They have an allocation method that they use to all of the entities that use the 911 services. The $705,000, we talked about the public safety sales tax on the revenue side of this. That's just passed through to the county. $10,000 for can't think of the dog's name. Anyway, for our K9 unit.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
I think it's T-Bone.
T-Bone, thank
but
you.
That's not, sure, but that's not why, it was just timing on that, because I actually have a different question. On the prior page, Mr. Hoagland, I'm looking in the right-hand column. Keep going, please. A little farther. Okay. So on the, thank you, that's perfect. On the right-hand column, where it says increased cost of uniforms, footwear, et cetera. Oh, whoops, go back down.
Okay, right there.
A little further. Okay, okay, perfect. So now to the right of your cursor, that one.
Where it says increased cost of uniform or total cost?
Up above that, Steve. There you are. You're there.
Up here?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'm a little bit confused of that placement of that wording next to in the overtime line item.
Yeah, that's just a misallocation of that cell. So
okay.
Yeah, I apologize for that. It's clearly not associated with overtime. This would be one of our supply lines. It should probably go down here. Office and operating supplies, we're projecting at 15,000. We've spent about 9,000 this year.
521. We're not needed to 21.
Here, the 25,000 uniform purchases.
Okay, that seems right, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's up 6,000 from the budget this year.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I just wanted to.
We had a glitch actually where we got off one line on our spreadsheet when it came up from finance. So some of the comments are a line off. So I apologize about that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it.
I think that brings us down to about the end of the police department. So unless there are other questions, we can jump into fire department. And again, working through the fire department, there's nothing unusual in the budget this year. We can go through some of these areas if council wants to explore some of these at a more detailed level, but nothing unusual here. Well, say nothing unusual, but I will point out we're planning on an increase in training here. When we went through the COVID budget amendment back in May, we cut training from pretty much all of our budgets. That's one of the discretionary areas within all of the departments. So there's a need in many of our departments to increase some of those training costs for next year. That's reflected here at 12,800. I wanted to point out the cost of volunteers at 55,000. The last couple of years, we really haven't spent much on that volunteer force, but that was put back into the budget for 21, anticipated to re-look at that volunteer program. So again, you can see an increase here, travel and training, 42,000 compared to 9,000 so far this year, but that 42,000 is more consistent with what we've done in prior years. $43,000 for Station 3 rent cost.
Here.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
We had adopted it by resolution, a program, a multi-year program for capital projects for the fire department, including eventually a whole new Station 3, some other things. I had looked for that and was unable to find it. I may be using the wrong search terms or something. Could we have that resolution sent out? I think that there's potentially some projects that are either coming up or were previously identified for 2021, and I want to know what we had informally committed to and what we're not doing.
Absolutely. We'll track that down.
Chief Kennedy, do you have any comments on this tonight?
Mayor Gear, yes, thank you. I don't have that list right in front of me, but what we did have on for 20 and 21 and 22 is the ladder truck and Station 3 were the big projects that were on there. A couple of things that I did talk to Steve a little bit beforehand was where we were at with the fire impact fees that we implemented last year, and how we could potentially phase some of this in, even if we don't do it all at once, potentially look at perhaps maybe a bond where we could phase in a ladder truck and maybe the investigative phase and the design phase of Station 3, knowing that that's going to be a multi-year project. So I do appreciate council's interest in still trying to stick to the time frame as much as possible, and we're at the same time also trying to, work within our COVID budget for this year and next year, and I don't know how long we're going to have to run that out.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Since Mr. Kennedy is available, can you tell us a little bit about how long we think the ladder truck can go without replacement?
We're already a year and a half past what its service life was. I can tell you that this year we've had a couple other major issues with it, to where we have water that was actually coming out through control panels when we were using it in a drill. So my honest opinion is the longer we use this, the more dangerous it becomes, and the higher likelihood that we could have a catastrophic failure with it. And that's what we want to try and avoid.
And what's about the dollar value?
We're looking at about 1.2, probably 1.1 to 1.2 million on the ladder truck.
Mayor Gear?
McDougall.
Mr. Kennedy, what's the closest ladder truck to us should ours fail and we had a call that required one?
The closest would be Burlington.
Okay. Thank you. 20 minutes? 25?
Minimum, yep.
I know this is a little out of line, but has the refinery ever done anything with the refinery's ladder truck, or do they have one? That would be helpful.
Shell does have a ladder truck. It gets a lot more complicated when we're talking private industry. They always say that they are willing to come out and help, but I know that there is a problem with their ladder truck being that it is not road legal.
Okay, well, that's, all right. No, that answers my question. I've been asked that before, so I wanted to clarify that.
Okay. And there's also quite a process to get refinery resources out here in general. So it's not impossible, but it does take time.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no more questions on Spire, we can jump down to the museum. Again, museum, as most of these departmental budgets, pretty much hold the line. As we noted earlier tonight, there's a 0.7 FTE open in the museum budget right now. Nothing really unusual, and no significant expenditures planned beyond the typical staff costs. Engineering, this is a little bit of engineering allocation into the general fund for some of that just general engineering time. Most of the engineering time is allocated out to specific projects or the utilities. Facilities, this 400,000, you may remember on the revenue side of the general fund, we were talking about 400,000 of transfers in to offset this 400,000 in facility projects.
Mayor Gare?
Mr. Walters.
I do recall that when you mentioned that. And when you mentioned that on the revenue side, you said to be spent in City Hall. Maybe that was not precise wording. Or do we anticipate the projects being spent actually on City Hall?
Yeah, pretty much. You can see, like on the bottom part of this budget. Yeah, okay. On the bottom part of this budget, this whole section used to be allocated to the senior center, which is now moved into Fund 101. So the majority of that work will be probably in City Hall, but there is some overflow. You're right, like into the museum, the libraries. You know, some of those decentralized areas do benefit from some of these projects as well. So it's not strictly City Hall.
At the risk of recalling some painful moments in previous budgets related to the facility projects line item, I would like to see a list of projects or capital needs, maintenance needs that justifies $400,000, and then we can talk about how we want to allocate it in a lump sum to be spent on any of those projects, only those projects, other projects, or line by line, certain amounts per project. But I think we ought to have a little bit more control over almost $500,000 in facility maintenance and potentially upgrades.
Yeah, fair enough. We during the Public Works section next Monday, let's dig into this a little at a more detailed level. And then the last section is our conservation program. It's primarily staff costs. Council may remember we used to allocate all of the conservation employee costs to the general fund, and then we would recoup some of that from the utilities through journal entries at year end. The state auditors recommended that we do a direct allocation of those staff costs, so that's why it's a lower number now than it used to be. It's not reflected in the prior years because of those journal entries that moved those monies. And then in supplies, $35,000 for a EV grant match and $5,000 for lighting projects.
Mayor Gare?
Mr. Walters.
So $30,000 for grant match there, is that just coming from general revenue?
Yes, we would have to, We'd have to double check any of our restricted revenues, like REIT. I love using REIT for a match when we can. But we've found in these areas, sometimes that doesn't work out. We need to use general revenue. But again, I apologize. I should have just tried to skim right over this one. It's part of Public Works, so I don't have detail on this tonight. The thought being that we would dig into details next Monday.
Okay, I just want to flag this now because the potential for the EV grant came to us either in the Finance Committee or in the Public Works Committee. I'm on both. And our conclusion as the committee, which of course is binding on no one, was that spending general revenue on electric vehicle charging stations, if that's what this is, was not something we were interested in at this time, given COVID and all of our other constraints. That was our advice.
Okay, well, we can lay out next week exactly what's involved there.
Okay. If there's no further questions on the general fund, we can jump down to the Parks and Rec Fund, Fund 101. So the expenditure side of this. So again, as we've discussed, the salaries, wages, benefits include positions that are not currently filled, and the student rec wages. You'll see in prior years we budgeted $28,000. This year we spent $4,000, and then just budgeting next year to kind of be along those same lines. I'm happy to dig into any of these if you have further questions. You can see like some of these up, like the supply line, $85,000 is what we had in the budget last year. We've only spent 12, probably not going to spend a lot more than that. I have every hope in the world that we'll be up more closer to that line next year. Professional services, we pay our instructors and referees out of that. Again, budgeted 41 this year, we're at 11. $41,000 is a rollover from the current year for depot improvements. Professional services, $101,000, pretty much a rollover of what we had this year. Again, operating supplies, same number that we had this year. We've spent about half of that. So happy to answer any questions you might have on parks. Pretty basic, pretty standard, kind of just rolling from what we had in prior years. Cemetery, part of the Parks Department as well. Nothing unusual here. Few supplies, staff costs primarily.
Here.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Does the parks budget reflect I think it's still a proposed transfer of the sailing program?
I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. You need to double check that.
Bob, is Bob with us? Maybe he can tell us.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I know we are close to executing that agreement with the Waterfront Alliance. I don't spend a lot of time on the rec side of the budget, and I would guess that there is some reflection that, but it would be me guessing right now. But we can certainly answer that question.
Okay.
Okay. If there's no more questions on parks or cemetery, we can jump down to the library. Couple of things I wanted to point out in the library. We've talked about their staffing positions. They are down 2 FTE, 3 positions. Actually, it's more than that. I think they have a couple of page positions that are still open as well. But I wanted to point out the supplies. I think in the prior year, last year, $83,000 was spent. Supplies purchased for inventory, that's the book budget. So when we went through the COVID budget amendment earlier this year, they cut their, I think it was at $85,000. They cut it down to $42,000. So far this year, they spent $37,000, and they are looking to go back up into that $81,000 range for their book budget. Their professional services budget, they've also dropped down to $30,000. We talked about on the revenue side a little bit with this budget that they have in place in the open position. They do have healthy cash reserves. I told Jeff that I was really supportive of trying to bump this back up into that 80,000 range for the coming year to try and get that book budget line back up to a more reasonable level. So not a lot else there. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. Otherwise, 104, we can talk about, that's the road maintenance department. We'll talk about that next Monday. 105 is the road construction department. We'll talk about next Monday as well. 106 is that's just the TBD sales tax pass-through. And then 107, back to Washington Park. We talked about this on the revenue side, how the way things are looking at Washington Park now, and the way the camping and boating is going. As long as those things kind of continue at even a moderately reasonable or moderately normal level, this expenditure budget will be able to be supported. Which is great. When COVID first set in, I thought for sure that the general fund would have to do a transfer of, I was thinking around 75,000, but it doesn't look like it will need it now. It looks like it'll be able to continue to stand on its own for the rest of this year and next year, which is great. If there's no questions on Washington Park, we can jump down to the parks construction. So Mayor Gear, here's the $350,000 grant you were talking about. So that's earmarked for the causeway. We have a $250,000 program for the cemetery, and that's to be funded with impact fees. Washington Park improvements at $75,000. That'll be REAP 1, and $25,000 improvements at Cap Santa, and that's from a donation. There's no questions about the parks construction. We can jump down to the EMS fund. That's Fund 110. And nothing unusual here. We do have the volunteer program. We talked about that in the fire department budget a little bit. So it's the same volunteers, just like our staff, our fire staff, their firefighter, paramedics. We split their time between these two funds, between the fire department in the general fund and Fund 110, the EMS fund. That's $20,000 for volunteers. This supply line is up a little bit at $135 for a new Zoll monitor and some additional equipment to support ambulance service. Miscellaneous, this is our write-offs. So we do budget for the amount of write-offs, and these are associated with the charges. So when we bill, again, we don't do the billing, we do the pre-billing, we gather the information, we send it to a third-party biller who bills the insurance companies for those ambulance transports. And a lot of those are written off insurance companies generally will only pay a certain amount of those. At the federal level, Medicare and Medicaid, the government only pays a set amount. What doesn't get paid from Medicare and Medicaid gets written off. We're not allowed, as a city, we're not allowed to follow up with the person who had the transport to try and collect the rest of that. If somebody is insured by a private carrier or no insurance, we will follow up with them directly to collect the balance for that transport. That's about it on EMS. Happy to answer any questions you might have there. Otherwise, we can jump down to the...
Hey, Gear?
Yes, Mr. Young.
Mr. Hoagland, I'm just curious. I know this may not be the platform for that, but if in offline, I understand that in that write-off after the insurance purposes that there's been reimbursement. And then for those people without insurance, they are billed directly because they don't have insurance. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Are they billed at a different rate than, let's say, at a Medicaid, Medicare rate? Because it would seem, I guess I'm curious, because it would seem that if they couldn't afford or did not have Medicaid, Medicare, then the likelihood of them being able to also afford a full bill at retail price would seem to be problematic for them as well. I want us to look at that just a little bit and maybe discuss it at some later point.
Sure, it's a fair point. And the transport rates that the city of Anacortes charges are consistent with what the county charges and with what the other carriers in the county charges. Those are set through an interlocal agreement. It's a fair point you raise, and I think it does make sense for future discussion.
Okay, and just one last point to that, and I'll let it go. You know, if we are working on housing and affordable housing, I just think that when the system charges one rate for those with insurance, that's great. But then for those who can't afford insurance, they're charged a higher rate. That's where I struggle just a little bit, and I'd love for us to talk about that at some later point. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if there's no further questions on the EMS fund, you can drop down. Fund 112 is the impact fee fund. So here on the expenditure side, we're just showing you transfers out of impact fees, $300,000 in road impact fees. We'll talk about next week, the programs that those are supporting, and then $250,000 in park impact fees to support the cemetery project. Fund 113, the ACFL fund. A little bit of money allocated in professional services for trail repair and construction. Not a lot else there. Fund 135, this is the tourism fund. Again, we talked about on the revenue side, this $379,000 is the same amount that was plugged in on the revenue side. Fund 335, this is the fund that the real estate excise tax flows through, REIT. So the expenditure side, $475,000. This is the $400,000 we talked about in facilities project. This is REIT 1, and then the $75,000 in Washington Park improvements. REIT 1 is less restricted than REIT 2, so we tend to use REIT 1 for general projects and parks projects. Just to avoid any confusion, there are some limitations on, I think it's for REIT 2 to use for purchasing parks property, but just to avoid any potential confusion with the auditors or others, we tend to stick to REIT 1 for these types of general projects and parks projects. $300,000, well, again, these are all in Public Works projects that we'll talk about next week, but to support overlays, ADA improvements, and sidewalks. That brings us down to the utilities. So we've managed to work our way through the governmental fund. Be happy to revisit any of those, or answer questions, and then plan on jumping into Public Works a week from tonight.
Questions, thoughts? Okay. So, I'm giving you a little bit to mull over and bring back. And feel free to email Steve or myself with questions of why we allocated what, where, and we'll get those questions answered really quickly for you. And at this time, if there's no other discussion, I'm going to move to item 6B. This is open for public comment. This is the Access Anacortes Fiber Internet Update. This is discussion only tonight. Ms. Shu?
Thanks, Mayor, Council, and members of the audience. I have a quick update tonight on access. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Having the same issue. There we go. So a quick update today on the October 2020 in regard to access Anacortes fiber internet. So I wanted to share this information in terms of our revenue, and just again to remark how it has increased from March of 2020 when we had 9 customers in service. 10 customers in service, and we now have 341 in service. Today was a really exciting day in the fiber department. We officially have a penetration rate of over 35% in each of our pilot areas, the CBD, Old Town, and M Avenue. And cumulatively, we have a 39.6% market penetration or take rate in those 3 pilot areas. We currently have 341 customers in service, and over 20% take rate throughout the whole city. I am very pleased to see that our take rate in our aerial expansion areas, which we're building out right now, continues to grow. And in the first area that we're going to be working on is aerial area 1 and 5, and we have a 16% take rate there with 117 pre-orders. And then the next area we'll move into are these 4 areas with 118 signups. We tend to look at each month at the customer selection and what plan that they're going with, and you will notice that there's been a little bit more of a tendency to go with the 100 megabit service, and it's just moved by about a percentage point. But then we still have 57% of our residential with 100 megabit and 43% at the gigabit service level. And then in the business, it's 56% at the 100 megabit and 44% at the gigabit service. I wanted to give you an update on our 2020 construction. As we mentioned earlier, this aerial area 1 and aerial area 5 are the first areas that we are working to build out. All of the make-ready aerial work on the PSE poles is complete. We just got notice of the final completion today. The underground boring in section 1 will begin on the 22nd, and then the aerial construction is scheduled. This area here in 1 through 5, the splicing work will be done beginning November 2nd. That is important for us because then we are able to begin all of those connections that we have the pre-orders in these areas. So that will begin in the beginning of November. And then we'll transition, and then we'll transition to these other areas, 3, 2, 3, 4, and 6. The underground work is already beginning. We'll have 2 boring crews on site this week, and then next week we'll have 2 separate aerial crews on site to begin just working really on that section 1 and 5 to get us ready to get our staff out there for the actual installation. So we have 234 orders that have been received to date in the aerial expansion areas, and we are very happy to continue to accept orders for anybody that is interested. So there's been some special projects that we've been working on during this time. We have an arrangement with the Samish Indian Nation to help provide service to their facilities. The Cannery Building and the Summit Park Road are both in service now. At the Longhouse, the underground boring will occur on the 22nd, and the design work is complete on the administration building. At Island Hospital, we're finalizing that work today and first thing tomorrow morning, and then they will be up and running with their dark fiber lease. And then we have in service already the NOAANET K-20 contract, and Chandler Square Retirement Center. I'm just mentioning that because, again, I want to put out to business owners that if you really need this service right away and we're not quite in your neighborhood, please reach out to us, because if you're able or interested in potentially doing some cost sharing with us, we can move the expediency in which we're able to get to you. And that was the case with Chandler Square. I wanted to just do a thanks to the water department. They have completed multiple underground street crossings, which allows us to do some additional customer installations. And we do have additional crossings that are in that work queue, but I'm just very appreciative of the partnership that they have had and the expertise that they bring to helping us with that. And in regard to 2021 financing and expansion, we are working on our forecasting revenue and projected construction costs. At the Fiber Committee this week, we will be reviewing a draft of what we have put together in terms of an updated business plan. The Public Works and Economic Adjustment Assistance Grant application is almost complete. We expect that will be submitted shortly. And we are making a request to cover all of our design and construction costs for next year. They can cover between, typically it's 80% if we would receive the full grant. Mr. Hoagland has also been working with Savvy Bank about establishing a line of credit that we discussed tonight. And just a reminder of the areas that we will be expanding to in the map, that it is the lettered areas. But basically, it's from A Avenue East following the city limit. So it would allow us to pass an additional 1,815 premises. The majority of that work is underground work. And so to ensure that we won't have delays, the design for that project is already underway. And we will very soon be placing material orders because there's been such a need in the or broadband, there's a little bit of a delay in terms of placing orders and receiving orders. So we want to make sure that we get in front of that. But by the end of 2021, we will have passed over 4,000 premises of the 7,600 in the city limits. We continue to do outreach and really Facebook has been very beneficial in terms of getting the word out, and there's been a steady stream of new orders of the last couple weeks. I think some of that is that school is back in place, and that it's an online format, and that people are really needing to have fast, reliable internet service, and that is what we're able to offer, and look to sign as many people up as possible. So looking forward, one of the things that you're going to see is that the pace of installation is going to increase significantly. Beginning the first week in November, once the splicing work is done, there's going to be just a very, very fast pace of getting those customers installed. The dark fiber lease policy is being drafted, and we're working with Ms. Swetnam on that. And then immediately following my presentation, we'll be talking about the unified fee schedule, putting in a fee for service calls. And this is specifically for customers who need assistance in configuring their own equipment. It's not equipment that they're using through the city offerings, or who need to repair damage that is something that they caused, that it wasn't something that our system isn't working properly. So with that, I just wanted to, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And again, thank you for allowing us to provide this important service within our community.
Thank you, Ms. Shu. Is there a member of the audience that would like to comment tonight? Okay, I don't see any hands, so I'll turn that over to the council now. Any comments or questions? Okay, well, hearing none, we will move on then to item number 6C, also open for comments. Resolution 3006, updating the unified fee schedule for the Access Anacortes Fiber Internet Customer Cause Service Call Fee. This is a discussion with a possible action. Ms. Shu.
I believe that Mr. Hoagland is presenting this.
Mr. Hoagland.
Sorry. Sorry, Mayor, Council. I was so focused on budget, I did not have a copy of this available, so.
If it's helpful, I'm happy to talk through it if you'd like, Steve.
Thank you.
And I don't have a copy of it in front of me either, but so what we are bringing forward tonight is an update to the unified fee schedule. And this will provide a system in which we will be able to share with our customers if they need us to be able to come to respond to damage that to their system that they have caused, or if they need some additional help to be able to set up equipment that is not city issued. So it's during the Monday through Friday regular work hours, it would be at $50 an hour rate, and then it would be at $75 during off hours. We thought that it would be important to have this codified so that we're able to share with people in advance so that they know. Nobody wants to have a service call at their home if they don't know what the potential costs associated with that are. And so that's why you're seeing this unified fee schedule proposal tonight.
If I may, I pulled up a copy. Let me see if I can, once again, I will try to share my screen. But it's just this section will be added to the unified fee schedule, the $50 per hour during city hours, and then $75 an hour outside of regular work hours. So very simple update to the fee schedule with a very clear schedule outlined.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young.
Yes, just a quick question about the fee schedule. Is it billable in half-hour or 1 hour segment?
It would be my expectation that it would be based on the amount of time that's spent there. So it would be based on probably at the quarter hour rate.
Got it. So every quarter hour, that's how it will be billed for the next quarter of an hour.
Yeah, we do something similar in the water utility now, and the staff tracks their time, so we're able to allocate that time very accurately. So we would do the same thing in this case.
All right, thank you.
You. Any member of the audience who wants to comment? Okay, back to the council.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
I think customer caused is a phrasal adjective and should have a hyphen.
Yeah. Good point. We can make that.
Mr. Hoagland?
Ma'am.
One of the things that we've been talking about during the monthly updates is that this would also be something that we would provide when we're assisting customers in configuring their own equipment, and I'm wondering if that's something that we would like to just clarify on this resolution.
I'm sorry. To clarify, which point?
If we're assisting customers in configuring their own equipment, it would be that's not damaged.
It's stated on there. It's already stated on there, Emily.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry. I was just looking at the section 1. I apologize.
No, it is in the resolution, so we're covered there.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Although the only thing that's going to show up in the fee schedule is the stuff that's in section 1, so if we want to build that out.
Okay.
That'd be maybe a good place to do it.
Good point.
Sure. We can add that. We can add that to the final draft.
So do we want to bring, if there's no other discussion, do we want to bring another, a final draft to council next week on the consent agenda maybe? Have a nod, head nod, more discussion? Okay, so Steve, if we can clean this up and get a final draft, we can bring it forward next week on the consent agenda.
Of course.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else tonight for the good of the order? Thank you all. Always a good long evening when we start working on budgets. I'll see you all soon. And at this time, I will adjourn the meeting. Good night, all.
Goodbye.